College football nerds here talking Georgia, Florida. We got a late start this week, but we are rolling with content going Wednesday, Thursday, Friday with content. So check it out. We did a pretty good video, probably one of the better videos I've seen, if I do say so myself, on the Michigan situation. So you might want to check that out. Link in the description. You know where to find us. And we haven't done a lot of Georgia content, a lot of Florida content this year. So we're going to remind y'all, collegefootballnerds.com. We're going to talk about our model here in a second. You can go on the website and play with that model. Do any two teams for a simulation. This is what we've been doing for like 6 years on this show. Well, now we've opened it up to you. It is free. We got a top 25 that's Nerd Nation top 25 that you guys put together. So it's open to everybody that has a login. That is also free. And we do a weekly top 25 and everybody contributes and it comes out really good. It's better than the AP. We've got really good statistics. So we've got overall rankings for players and teams. You can see your team's profile and see how the relative performance numbers look, meaning not only are your overall rankings there, but see how you compare against the other teams that have played your opponents, and then we rank everybody in the nation on that. So it gives really good context. Finally, NFLU statistics. So on Sunday, don't go chasing around a bunch of different box scores. See all those Florida players, all those Georgia players in one place, one click. You can see all the NFL stats for all those games. It's a lot of fun. All right, Josh, let's talk about this game a little bit. I want to start with the model, but with some context for the model, because Georgia fans were all over us for that Auburn game. SI picked it up and talked about how there's some model out there predicting Auburn to beat Georgia. The original version, before we found a bug, of the model did have Auburn winning by 1 point. We tweaked that a little bit. We found our error. We apologized publicly. We own our losses. And it still only had Georgia winning by 1 or 2 points. It was a close game, which turned out our model was the only one that predicted a close game. So I think that while we talk about what's going on here, Georgia fans will appreciate where the model's headed. But I just wanted to give that context that we don't use a model that has any priors. It's just numbers from this year, and it learns as data comes in. And Georgia was not modeling well at the beginning of the year. And Georgia fans will tell you they weren't dominant against South Carolina. They weren't dominant against Auburn, teams that aren't great, you know. And so I think we've seen or felt this year that Georgia hasn't been maybe the Georgia of the past, although I'd argue that they don't have to be to win it all this year. But Josh, they really kind of kicked it into gear with the Kentucky game, a team that our model likes a lot, and kind of showed everybody that they can be the Georgia of old. So why don't you talk a little bit about where they're trending and what the model says for this game?
Yeah, so Georgia, as you said, Georgia was a close game in our model, and there was a bug that originally had them Auburn winning, and we caught that within 24 hours. But, of course, SCI picked it up the day I think we launched the model data, so they made a slight adjustment we had to fix to fix some bad data, but it still had that game being extremely close. The thing I'm going to lead with, Georgia ain't in the same place they were then. You know, after that 27-20 game against Auburn, they turn around and blast Kentucky, beat Vanderbilt 37-20, a little bit of a sleepy game, but still statistically for the most part a dominant one. And it's kind of amazing how much that's shifted a lot of opinions. Not just that, but Auburn turning around and looking really terrible. If you run the same model today, so we tested this as we're sort of working and updating our models. It actually has that game 41-12 Georgia. If Georgia were to play Auburn today, same model. Just the new data that's come in, how much more dominant Georgia's been, how much Auburn struggled, you know, their secondary's fallen off, there's a lot of pieces. That's the level of shift. In Georgia, we've been toying with this 1 through 133 ranking. And I'll pause here and say, if you haven't liked and subscribed, do so. I know it's cheesy to say, but we're going to be starting to release some stuff, and we're going to have a video about these rankings, you know, the 1 through 133, talking about the top 25, going into more details of stuff we're releasing, including a brand new version of the model that's going to be hopefully a good bit even more accurate, and it deals with a lot more adjustments than we were able to do due to having access to a lot more granular data than we used to. But you know, the models picked up on this stuff, and Georgia went from, in this 1 through 133 ranking that we've been beta testing and refining for a while, they were around a top 15 team. Right now, in the one we just spit out, I think they're number 4. Daniel, if I've got this right, So they've jumped from like top 15 there with Alabama, sort of floating around, 13th, 16th in the country in performance just on on-field results. And now all of a sudden our model thinks they're straight up the fourth best team in the country just based on this week's results. It would, it has them over Washington, it has them over Oklahoma, has them over Texas. The only three it's behind are Michigan, Ohio State, and Oregon. Giving away another video, but if you're interested to hear more about that, check that other piece of content out. So that says a lot about where Florida's been headed as a football team. The problem is they're playing Florida, and Florida's snuck a little lower. So the model, as we're getting to later, starts to favor Georgia really heavily, and it's really less about Florida and more about how dominant Georgia's been, how much they've solved issues that we talked about. We flagged when they were playing Auburn that Georgia defensively was struggling a little bit with the run game. Their run defense wasn't particularly good in our statistics. It is now 25% better again than opponent averages, right? We have this relative performance statistic. How do you do against the teams you played versus how everybody else did against those teams you've played? And it just, are you 25% better? Are you 30% worse? 25% better in rush defense, 28% better in pass defense, 16% better rush offense, 17% better pass offense. The offense is good. It's not what it was last year or the year prior. The defense has become very good again, though. It wasn't there just 3 or 4 weeks ago. And the quality of the performance and just sort of the relative nature of the teams they've played look a lot better. And it's just turned out to be a really good team on paper.
Yeah, and I don't want to just talk numbers because we'll lose people. It's fun for us, but they kind of might get sleepy on us. But I will say that in the numbers we were seeing early on, the Georgia run defense wasn't Georgia standard. And it's still not Georgia standard. Like in the last couple of years, Georgia's modeled like the best run defenses we've seen, save like a 2016 Alabama or some of these other like just ridiculous run defenses. So I think if there's an opportunity for Florida, it's got to be in the run game. But like even with the Auburn game, a lot of the rushing numbers that they gave up were kind of not expecting a statue quarterback to run a little bit. And I don't know that that's a path for Florida. My concern with Florida in this game, in terms of matchups versus Georgia, is we're seeing Mertz put up some numbers, but it's against South Carolina. It's against Vanderbilt. And we talk about this all the time where, in the middle of the season, a lot of people will lean towards momentum as signaling a great improvement or leaps and bounds, gain in confidence or comfort in the system, when a lot of times it's just who you played. Like you hit momentum because you didn't play anybody. I do think Mertz is playing better than he was like in the Florida game. So I do think there is a combination of who they played, but also him being more comfortable in the system. When they played Utah, that game was not indicative of who they are now. I think that if they played that game again, it would probably be much closer, if not maybe a Florida win. And I know Utah just beat USC, but we're not high on USC. My concern with Florida is they weren't able to run the ball against Kentucky, 2.4 yards per carry. Against South Carolina, 2.2 yards per carry. Graham Mertz, while I do think he's more comfortable in this system and is playing a little bit better, even a lot of bit better, I don't think he is going to be able to carry a game against Georgia if they can't run the ball.
Yeah, I think that's the long and short of it. Georgia has improved. And, I had conversations with people about that Auburn-Georgia game in advance where they're kind of questioning the model. There are a couple forums that had conversations, like On Three's forum. Really great guys over there moderating it, and we talked a little bit about it. Where I was saying, like, oh, this is ridiculous that Auburn would be close. And the note then was they've been struggling outside the tackles, but Auburn was inside the tackle team. Well, it turned out Auburn was able to get some yardage by running Peyton Thorne a lot more than anyone thought they would. It's kind of a one-trick pony. But it did expose the fact that I think Georgia doesn't have quite the same sideline-to-sideline ability to contain that they had a few years ago when they had such a great line. And guys like Nakobe Dean, they were just running free without anybody ever touching them, and Monty Rice and those guys. Kentucky was a different animal, though. And in those discussions, they were bringing up Kentucky, and I said, look, after the game, like, I don't think the same thing's going to apply to Kentucky. And I know I brought this up in a video because Kentucky wants to run the ball between the tackles. They don't have any ability to run the ball with Devin Leary. So it played into their hands a lot more. And, Graham Mertz is athletic enough, but he ain't a runner. So Georgia's ability to stop the run between the tackles, which I think is still pretty good, has held up. It's not what it was in terms of, again, they had one of those D lines that would just be 2 yards in the backfield at every snap, but they still hold point. They still make tackles between the tackles. They just don't keep the linebackers as clean, which also makes it harder for them to get edge to edge. But I think in a game like this, it gives them a lot of advantages. And this is where I'll say if you're a Florida or Georgia fan, again, like and subscribe if you like it, because this is going to turn maybe a little more negative for me when it comes to Florida. Florida's got issues. And when you talked about it, right, Graham Mertz had 6.9 yards per attempt against Tennessee. He's averaged around 8 yards per attempt the last few games. The one big one's Charlotte, where he's 21 of 24 passing, but it's Charlotte. They're particularly bad this year. But I'll note, even in the Tennessee game, things get kind of tough, right? They had a 20-point second quarter, which included an interception on the Tennessee 18-yard line, where they kind of got a flurry of points in a few drives. But Tennessee, lost by 13, but they lost by 13 while outgaining Florida by 40 yards. Florida and Mertz only threw for 6.9 yards per attempt in that game. They only ran the ball for 4.3 yards per carry in that game. Did they deserve to win? Yes. Did they get credit for the win? Yes. How does that win apply in terms of projecting how they do against Georgia? Still not actually that good. And that's the problem, right? Is, as I said, they slipped down this list of teams where Georgia's crawled the way up to number 4 on, our little ranking system here. Florida's down at 43rd. They're sitting between Toledo and Georgia State in this ranking that we're working on. So, half the problem here is I think Florida started the year with issues at the offensive line against Utah that made them look worse than I think they even are, which, frankly, that game is actually looking worse and worse for the Pac-12 due to how Florida's looking relative to the SEC, which is its own conversation. We flagged in that game that they took transfers like guys like George that had really struggled in Alabama in a couple games. It was a big part of why they had that near loss in 21 to Auburn, and they haven't been able to put a roster together. And I'll say, as I turn it back to you, Daniel, it doesn't give me a lot of confidence in Georgia, but I also don't really blame Napier for the situation because we've been tracking this for like 5 years now. And if you stuck around with us as a Florida fan, we've been talking about it. The recruiting under McElwain and then Mullen was terrible. And we kept saying, look, this is just going to pile up until it gets to the point where you can't fix this in 2 years. And they tried to turn to the transfer portal to fix as much as they could. Some of them panned out, some of them haven't. We've seen over the course of the year, nobody that's really relied on the transfer portal, and I'll include Colorado in that batch, has been able to play consistently good football, maybe good in spurts, but not consistently good. And that's where Napier's at. I mean, this is a total rebuild, and we're late in the season. You get a little more banged up. Depth starts to matter, and I think we're seeing the reality of the roster, and I think it's a reality that's going to be hard for Florida to escape in this game.
Yeah, I'm super high on Napier. Like, I'm sticking to my guns on Napier the same way I did with Sark at Texas all offseason. I said year 3 for Sark. Probably going to say year 4 for Napier. Year 3 for Sark is where I said he was going to win a conference championship. And I didn't care what he did year 1 or year 2 because I knew what he inherited. And he inherited a little bit better average athlete than Napier did. But he inherited guys that looked great and didn't play great. And so there was a lot to unlearn, and I think Napier's dealing with that too. So I think there's a difference between liking Florida this season to beat Georgia versus liking, holding long on Florida, which I'm doing. And not in a Josh Pate way where I'm long on everybody. I'm actually long on Napier, and y'all can quote me on that if he washes out.
You never get in your challenge now, man. Never get in the challenge.
I was never going to get one. That's why I got this right here, by my own chalice. But yeah, so I think that those are two totally different things. I also think that, we haven't talked about Bowers being out at all. And I do think he presents a matchup problem and a little bit of a safety blanket for Beck. We saw this in the Auburn game that is a little bit cause for concern if you're Georgia playing a team that can score. I don't think it's as big of a concern in this game because I don't think Florida's going to be able to break a 14 to 20 point threshold. And if we look at Florida on a Josh, would you agree or disagree? If Florida scores 20, that's a good day. That even Florida fans should admit that's a good day for them.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely the case.
So the question then is, can Georgia score 20 points without Bowers? Which I think they can. Now, they don't hit their ceiling without him, but I think they can score enough to win the game. I also think, and I'm going to go ahead and give my pick on this, and maybe we can talk off of this but I also think that Florida's going to run into a situation where they have short fields and stalled drives. I don't crush them as much in the second half of the Tennessee game as I do like Kentucky or their performance against South Carolina, at least defensively. You look at that Tennessee game, and I just think that's a great win. I don't think Tennessee's a great team, but I think that's a great win for Florida. We both picked that game in our pick'em. We said it was easy money, actually. Florida sat on the ball in the second half, and that's why they scored 3 points. They knew that Tennessee wasn't going to score. They knew that they could sit on the football, and they did, and they won. But in this game, I think we're going to see some short fields from offensive sputtering because the Georgia defense is good and not because Florida's offense is bad, and it's going to lead to some easy points. This happens a lot that I predict things in this way. Give me Georgia 33, Florida 17. I'm still long on Napier.
Yeah, and I'll take that and run with it further. I think this game has the potential to get more out of hand because Georgia's probably going to build up a score, and Florida's probably not going to feel like they can just keep it respectable. I'm actually going to give my score, which is 41-17. And it's funny because we haven't even given the model score, so I'll do that in a minute. It's backwards how we always normally do it. It's telling to me these are the two teams that are worst in sacks in the conference. Georgia has 12, Florida has 11, dead last in the SEC. If Florida had more of a pass rush, I'd give them more of a chance. Even if they were first and second, it would give Florida more of a chance in my book. But Carson Beck has been playing very good football, something we haven't really talked about so much. The surrounding cast at Georgia has been playing good football. They have a number of good receivers. Bowers was their best player more than anything just because of how you could use him in different ways, gave them matchup advantages. We talked about the loss of Darnell Washington. I think it will affect them here. Florida is going to be able to be a little more schematically sound because Georgia's going to be more predictable in what they're doing without Bowers because you can't cover him with a linebacker, so you have to constantly compromise yourselves in different ways by having an extra safety or somebody on the field to deal with him, and then you get run over. Florida can kind of avoid that problem, but I still think points are gonna really stack up. And the problem with Florida is I think Pearsall is a good receiver. Frankly, I think he's just good. And I don't think they have another receiver on that roster that is particularly good by SEC standards. And if Mertz is having to throw to that receiving core behind that offensive line, even with Georgia not being an excellent pass rush, in a come-from-behind situation, I think it's going to fall apart. So the two model, there's sort of multiple models that are going on behind the scenes. We're rolling out a model V2. Again, we're going to do a 1 through 133 ranking, talk about a top 25. This whole new set of modeling data that we've been developing now for the last several weeks, doing a lot of stuff we wanted to do for years, and now that we're automating it, we can actually do it because it's a lot of computations. Even with a nice computer, it actually takes a while to run all this. There's a couple sub-models, and we're not sure how much we're going to expose over time with this, but giving you a peek behind the curtain, one model has Georgia 41, Florida 12. One model has Georgia 27, Florida 14, more or less. And the predicted score is around 34 to 13 when you amalgamate them. But normally they're not that divergent, and it really speaks to the fact that Georgia, it's not really sure if Georgia is going to score 27, if they're going to score 41. And again, I went 41-17. That's the upper end of what the model, not even really the upper end, but it's sort of the upper range of how the model thinks Georgia may work. And Florida, though, is only in the 12 to 14 range. So it's basically saying with Georgia, I'm not really sure if they're going to be a high-scoring team or not. They've been a little unpredictable in that regard, and the model, for lack of a better term, had a hard time making up its mind just how high-scoring Georgia's really going to be relative to Florida in their defense. There's a lot of pace of the game issues that are involved, style of the game, what matters more, Georgia's offensive style or Florida's defensive style, and how that correlates to production. Again, we have some really different modeling approaches than I think everybody else, which is always makes for interesting results. But Florida is stuck at like 12 to 14 points. And that's the problem. The model does not see a universe where Florida is going to score really even 20. I'm not saying it's impossible, but the model just doesn't see it. And so whether this is a close game or a blowout, the harsh reality is the model sees this as a game that Georgia's always going to inevitably win. And I think the net result is going to be, when does that happen? And depending on when it happens, it's going to, kind of determine how much the dogs get, how much they let off the dogs or not, terrible pun that I'm trying to avoid and manage not to walk myself out of. And I think that's going to determine the score, right? How much Florida tries to press, when Georgia gets a lead. And I always hate having conversations about games like this, but, it's a big game, and frankly, in a slow week. So it's one we would cover anyway, but you end up with this game being a bit of a dud, I think, relative to just where Georgia's at and where Florida's at from a rebuilding program.
Yeah, and I think this is an opportunity. We've seen Georgia kind of use this game in the past to kick off their postseason campaign. That momentum you need leading into the end of the year, where Florida may even be perceived as a decent team or a really good team or a challenge to Georgia coming in, and they kind of really make a statement. I see that maybe happening this year again, but if my score plays out 33-17, I don't think that's a massive statement, but I think Georgia fans will take it. I keep going back to this notion that we're so stuck in thinking about, if you're an Alabama fan this year, you're thinking about Alabama teams of the past. If you're a Georgia fan this year, you know what your championship teams look like in the past, and you probably know your team doesn't look like that this year. That in no way means you can't win a championship. We are so used to comparing year to year that we forget that this year is its own thing, and there ain't no 2020 Alabama, 2019 LSU, 2021 Georgia walking through the door in 2023. It's just a different year. Defenses have caught up. Offenses don't look as good. We've got some COVID hangover and some, a little bit of bad evals on quarterbacks. We did a video on that too. And I just think that everybody, not just Georgia fans, but especially Georgia fans, need to think about the fact that, okay, your team doesn't look great against subpar competition. Nobody's smoking everybody this year that doesn't have access to the other team's signs. Nobody's smoking everybody this year in the way they have in years past. So don't let that concern you and think that you're not championship material or as good in terms of placement as you were in years past.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And we had a really good conversation. You can go look on our channel on YouTube or go through our Spotify and find it on quarterbacks, talking about how that's changed. And one of our big points is that having veteran quarterbacks has become more important. And I think it's because as people figured out the RPO, being able to run pro-style stuff matters again. And running a pro-style offense is about reads. It's about NFL-style concepts. And those things scale well is the big thing I'll note, right? They do better when you play really good defenses. So we're seeing these games now where the top teams are ending up in more competitive matchups, and they can't blow out the lesser teams because everybody's sort of building to beat the other. The elites are building to beat the other elites. They're building to beat what Georgia's been the last couple of years. Those style of offenses are going to be a lot more competitive against Georgia, sure, which is why they're struggling sometimes off and on. And maybe they're, that Missouri, Ole Miss, Tennessee gauntlet you've got to run is actually pretty hard. But it also means that they're not running the RPO scheme where, Alabama would beat every crappy team they played by 55-10 before they almost lose to Georgia in the 2018 championship game. So this becomes much more of a free-for-all year. I agree with you. I mean, I think anybody can win the title. None of the teams look particularly great. It's true of Georgia, true of everybody else. It's just a different place where college football is at. And in a lot of ways, it makes it more interesting, right? Because these lower-scoring games, in my opinion, I'm maybe an old-school purist, I think they're more fun and they're more competitive. But I think a lot of people see lesser passing yardage, less dominant run games in these kind of throwaway games, and they think football is worse. And I don't think it's true. I think it's just changed. But it is also still a year where there aren't those extremely dominant quarterbacks and receiving games and what have you. Carson Beck's leading the SEC right now, at least last I checked, in time to throw, meaning he's getting the ball out faster than any other quarterback in the conference. He understands that offense as well as anybody in the conference. He may not be, Stetson Bennett in some ways. He may not be Bryce Young in a lot of other ways, but he's still better than what just about anybody else has in the SEC right now. So yeah, I mean, and Georgia fans obviously got to know that they have a chance to win the title. But even if this isn't the 21 or 22 team, I don't know that their odds are any worse of winning a title than they had been the past couple of years.
All right, y'all. That's it for us on this one. Let us know in the comments what you think the score is going to be. Remember, like and subscribe. We haven't talked a lot to you Florida or you Georgia fans this year, but obviously as that schedule gets tougher for Georgia, we're going to be hitting you all up with more content. You're going to see that. Also, remember, check out our Michigan sort of, I don't want to say cheating yet. They haven't been proven to be cheating yet, but we did a video on their situation. Check that out. I think you'll really enjoy it. And also collegefootballnerds.com. You can play around with the model. You can check out all the advanced statistics that we have out there for you for free. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.